Hello everybody and welcome to today's video analysing the character of Juliet. The audience first meets Juliet in Act 1 Scene 3 where a number of key points are established. To begin with, we learn that Juliet has a distant relationship with her mother and a close relationship with her nurse. Lady Capulet cannot bear to talk to Juliet alone. Nurse, give leave a while, we must talk in secret. Nurse, come back again. This presents the mother-daughter relationship as distant. The audience sees that Nurse has been with Juliet since she was born, faith I can tell her age and to an hour. This closeness of relationship is understood further when we learn that Nurse was the wet nurse for Juliet. A wet nurse is someone who breastfeeds the child of someone else. A wet nurse in Elizabethan England would have been a woman of lower class employed to feed the child of a higher class family. We learn that Nurse had her own daughter, Susan, who died, and Nurse took on the role of wet nurse for Juliet. The presence of a wet nurse was common in rich families in Elizabethan England, but they would only be employed until the baby was weaned. In the play, nurses stayed on as a guardian for Juliet, who is now 13 years old. In a scene focused on asking Juliet what she thinks of the idea of marrying Paris, it's notable just how little dialogue Shakespeare gives her. Juliet only has 8 lines in Act 1 Scene 3, whereas Lady Capulet and the nurse take up 90% or so of the dialogue, so what impression do we get from the little that Juliet does say in this introductory scene? When Lady Capulet asks her daughter, "How stands your disposition to be married?" Juliet responds with the non-committal, "It is an honour that I dream not of." Juliet is guarded and cautious here, sidestepping the question, but is she telling the truth? Has she never thought of marriage? In Act 2 Scene 2 she's certainly thinking of marriage with Romeo, telling him, "If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow." Either way, Juliet is guarded with her mother, giving very little away. She's much more open with her nurse, as we shall soon see. Although Act 1 Scene 3 is the first time the audience meets Juliet, it's not the first time she's been the focus of the play. Act 1 Scene 2 sees Paris talking to Lord Capulet about the possibility of marrying Juliet. This scene might confuse a modern audience, but in Shakespeare's time, arranged marriages were common, particularly for middle and upper class families. To understand this fully, let's explore the role of women in Elizabethan England. Women belonged to their fathers and then their husbands when they married, could not attend school or university, could not purchase or own property, could not vote, were not allowed on stage. In plays, the female roles were acted by young men. With this in mind, perhaps Juliet says very little in Act 1 Scene 3 because she knows that her future marriage is outside of her control, or at least it is expected to be. But things are about to change when the audience next sees Juliet in Act 1 Scene 5. Juliet meets Romeo in Act 1 Scene 5 at the Capulet Ball, where the exchange between the two is significant. "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this, my lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand, to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which manly devotion shows in this, for saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Ay, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. O then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Then move not, while my prayer's effect I take." Romeo and Juliet's words combine here to form a Shakespearean sonnet, a form of love poetry which has 14 lines of iambic pentameter, that's 10 alternating unstressed and stressed syllables per line, with the rhyme scheme ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, GG. Shakespeare's employment of the sonnet form symbolises that the couple are perfect for each other and that they complete each other. Only when together do their words create a sonnet, symbolising how they found true love. However, it is possible to see in this exchange some of the same caution Juliet had with her mother previously. In the exchange with Romeo, Juliet often mirrors or repeats his words. Romeo mentions pilgrim, hand, kiss, and Juliet's reply includes the same words. Romeo mentions lips, and Juliet replies with the same word. Romeo mentions saints and prayer, and Juliet replies with the same words. This language mirroring is similar to the exchange between Juliet and Lady Capulet in Act 1 Scene 3. "Speak briefly, can you like of Paris's love? I'll look to like, if looking liking move." Lady Capulet mentions like, and Juliet replies with the same words. What could this mirroring from Juliet suggest? Perhaps it indicates how she is slightly cautious with Romeo, trying not to give too much away of her own feelings. Or perhaps it's simply flirting, punning on Romeo's words for playful effect. Whatever the cause, it is notable how Juliet only expresses her feelings fully when she believes she's alone in the balcony scene of Act 2, Scene 2. Little does she know she's being observed by Romeo. In Act 2, Scene 2, Shakespeare presents Juliet as mature, and he heightens this through contrast with Romeo's immaturity. When Romeo spies Juliet at the window, he declares it is the east and Juliet is the sun. This is the first of many hyperbolic statements from Romeo. His words are an example of a blazon, describing women using a range of grand metaphors. His poetic hyperbole continues when Juliet asks him a practical question, "How camest thou hither? The orchard walls are high and hard to climb," and Romeo replies with love's light wings did I o'erperch these walls." Juliet ignores this nonsensical comment and again gives a very down-to-earth, practical warning: if they do see thee, they will murder thee. Once again, Romeo's reply is ridiculous. "Alack, there lies more peril in thine eye than 20 of their swords." Again and again in this exchange, Romeo's words are hyperbolic and poetic, whilst Juliet's are practical and mature. The juxtaposition between the two heightens the impact and shows the audience Juliet's maturity and wisdom. Many people argue that Shakespeare was a proto-feminist. Feminism is the belief that women should have the same rights, opportunities, and power as men. Feminism as it exists today did not exist in Shakespeare's time, so we use proto at the beginning to make that distinction. Scholars often look at Shakespeare's female characters and point to their eloquence and strength of character, concluding that Shakespeare must have been sending some sort of message about women and what he thought of them. And this is most definitely the case when it comes to Juliet, who's presented in far superior tones to Romeo, despite being only 13 years old. In her wisdom, it is Juliet who instigates discussion about marriage to Romeo. "If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purpose marriage, send me word tomorrow." The mirroring has now disappeared and Juliet is leading the conversation. "If that thy bent of love be honourable" suggests that Juliet is still cautious about Romeo's intentions. And all of this is very important for Juliet, as evidenced in a seemingly insignificant line when she tries to get the attention of the retreating Romeo: "Bondage is hoarse and may not speak aloud." Juliet is pointing out here how she must speak quietly as she's under her father's control, a stark reminder of the context of the play. Let's just pause and think about what's happening here. Juliet is at her bedroom window in Capulet's house. Romeo has climbed over the wall into the Capulet orchard and is speaking from the ground below. This setting is highly significant. Juliet is where she is supposed to be, but Romeo is not. Now here's a list of every setting in the play. Let's look at where we see Romeo and where we see Juliet in the play. Here's Romeo, here's Juliet. Now there are two things to note here. Firstly, Juliet rarely leaves her parents' property. In fact, she only does so when she heads to Friar Lawrence's cell. Shakespeare's use of setting reminds us of the patriarchal society in which Juliet lives. In Elizabethan England, a husband legally owned his wife and daughters. When a daughter married, she then became the property of her husband, and the use of setting for Juliet reinforces this. Apart from a brief visit to the friar in Act 4, Scene 1, Juliet is always seen in her father's property. The bondage Juliet refers to here is the fact that she's held captive by the expectations of a patriarchal society. Patriarchy is a system where men possess power and women are excluded from it. Patriarchy also refers specifically to a family where the father is in control, and we see both in Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's father decides who she marries and when. Paris discusses his marriage proposal with Lord Capulet, not with Juliet. In stark contrast to this, not only is Romeo never seen at his home, the Montague household does not feature as a setting of the play at all, but as Arati Kanika points out in Architecture's Pretexts, Spaces of Translation, Romeo's presence can be traced at every location that is mentioned in the play, and that quotation is used with permission, so thank you for that. So Romeo essentially appears everywhere at some point or another. Whilst Juliet remains at home, Romeo is free to roam the streets and is bold enough to enter the property of his sworn enemy. Juliet is indeed in bondage, whilst Romeo is not. The differing expectations of a young man and a young woman in Elizabethan England are evident through the locations in which the characters appear. Juliet is cautious because she has to be. She does not have the same freedom as Romeo. In Act 2, Scene 5, we see more of the close relationship that Juliet has with her nurse. Nurse returns to Juliet, who's desperate to know what Romeo has said. The audience knows that Romeo has proposed marriage, but the nurse drags it out in lines like this: Your love says, like an honest gentleman, and a courteous, and a kind, and a handsome, and, I warrant, a virtuous. Where is your mother? Where is my mother? Why, she is within. Where should she be? How oddly thou repliest. Your love says, like an honest gentleman, where is your mother? What's happening here is the nurse is deliberately winding Juliet up by dragging out the news of Romeo's proposal. The comic exchanges between the two signify the closeness of the relationship, as does the fact that Juliet confides in her nurse in the first place. After meeting Romeo in Act 1 Scene 5, Juliet asks Nurse to identify him. Then in Act 2 Scene 4, Juliet confides in her nurse and sends her to meet Romeo. It is the nurse who takes the rope ladder needed for Romeo to ascend into Juliet's chamber, and the nurse sets it up in Act 4 Scene 2. It is the nurse who's sent to deliver a message and a ring to Romeo at Friar Lawrence's cell in Act 3 Scene 3. It is the nurse who warns Juliet in Act 3 Scene 5 that her mother's about to walk into the room and find her with Romeo, and it is the nurse who stands up to Capulet in the same scene, telling him you are to blame to rate her so. We therefore see very clearly that the nurse has a close relationship with Juliet. We can see Nurse as a surrogate parent to Juliet, in much the same way as we see Friar Lawrence as surrogate parent to Romeo. But this relationship between Juliet and her nurse grows apart as the play progresses. In Act 3 Scene 2, the audience finds the nurse unable to understand why Juliet is siding with Romeo after Tybalt's death. She proclaims, "Will you speak well of him that killed your cousin?" Juliet, who doted on Nurse at the start of the play, is becoming a young woman and moving beyond such childish things as needing what is essentially a full-time babysitter. As a result, she's starting to distance herself from the people she associates with childhood. Juliet and the nurse will continue to grow apart throughout the play. Juliet's relationship with Nurse is further damaged in Act 3 Scene 5 when Nurse tells Juliet she should forget the newly banished Romeo and marry Paris. For Juliet, this is the final straw. She dismisses her nurse and rants, "Ancient damnation, O most wicked fiend! Is it more sin to wish me thus forsworn, or to dispraise my lord with that same tongue which she hath praised him, with above compare so many thousand times? Go, counsellor, thou and my bosom henceforth shall be twain. I'll to the friar to know his remedy. If all else fail, myself have power to die." In other words, Juliet vows never again to tell Nurse what is in her heart. The relationship, as far as Juliet is concerned, is over. This newfound declaration of independence is reiterated later in the scene. Having told her mother and Nurse to leave, Juliet begins to worry about the situation she's in and panics about the terror of the place, the tomb, to which she is heading. For a moment, she loses her nerve and calls the nurse back, but soon realises she needs to act alone. Juliet has at this point fully outgrown the nurse. She's been betrayed by her in Act 3 Scene 5, with the nurse advising a second marriage to Paris, and has realised that the nurse can help her no further. Finally, let's explore the deaths of Romeo and Juliet. As Cedric Watts points out in the introduction to the Wordsworth edition of the play, there is more dramatic emphasis placed on Juliet than Romeo, as her death occurs later in the play. If we compare this to a play like Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth dies off stage in an earlier scene to the death of Macbeth, we understand Watts's point. Juliet being the last to die means she has the greater impact on the audience, and again this backs up the proto-feminist interpretation, with Juliet being presented as wiser and more important than Romeo. For key quotations, let's begin with Juliet's early mirroring, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much," moving to assertive behaviour, "If that thy bent of love be honourable, thy purposed marriage, send me word tomorrow." We might also choose an example of Juliet's practical level-headed approach in contrast to Romeo's hyperbole, "If they do see thee, they will murder thee." And finally, let's select an example of the growing distance in Juliet's relationship with her nurse, "Ancient damnation." If you found this video useful, please do subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. Everything I go through in these videos can be found in the new 3rd edition of Mr. Bruff's Guide to Romeo and Juliet, available through following the links in the description.